The wagon wheels creaked against the rocky trail as Sarah Mitchell gripped the wooden seat beneath her. Dust clouds swirled around the convoy of families heading west toward the Oregon Territory. Her husband James sat beside her, his weathered hands steady on the reins. Behind them, their two children bounced with each bump in the road. "Mama, when will we see the new house?" 8-year-old Emma asked, her blonde braids dancing as the wagon jolted over another stone. "Soon, sweetheart," Sarah replied, though she had no idea when they would reach their destination. The wagon master had promised them 3 more weeks of travel, but they had already been on the trail for 2 months. 6-year-old Thomas pressed his face against the canvas covering. "Papa, why is Mr. Henderson's wagon stopping?" James pulled their horses to a halt as the entire convoy came to a standstill. Ahead of them, families gathered around Henderson's wagon. Sarah could see Mrs. Henderson crying while her husband knelt beside their youngest child. "Stay here with the children," James told Sarah as he climbed down from their wagon. Sarah watched as James jogged toward the crowd. She could hear fragments of conversation carried on the wind. The Henderson boy had been sick for days with fever. Now he was much worse. Dr. Whitman, the only medical man in their group, shook his head grimly as he examined the child. "It's the typhoid," he announced. "The boy needs rest and medicine we don't have." The wagon master, a tough man named Captain Morris, gathered the adults together. "We can't stop here," he declared. "We have maybe 4 weeks before the mountain passes close for winter. If we get trapped, we all die." "But the child needs care," Mrs. Henderson pleaded. "He can't travel in his condition." Morris's face was stone. "Then you stay behind. The rest of us move on at first light." A cold silence fell over the group. Sarah felt her heart sink. Staying behind meant almost certain death. Winter was approaching fast, and they were still hundreds of miles from any settlement. Without the protection of the group, a single family would never survive. That evening, families whispered around their campfires. Some said Morris was right. They had to think of everyone's safety. Others believed they should all stay together, no matter what. James returned to their wagon as Sarah tucked the children into their blankets. "What will happen to the Hendersons?" she asked quietly. "Morris won't change his mind," James said. "He's seen too many wagon trains get caught in early snow. Says it's better to lose one family than lose everyone." Sarah shuddered. She had known the Hendersons since they all left Independence, Missouri. Mrs. Henderson had helped deliver Emma when Sarah was sick with pregnancy fever. Their oldest son played with Thomas every evening. "Maybe the boy will get better overnight," Sarah suggested hopefully. James shook his head. "Dr. Whitman says he's getting worse. Even if he improves, he'll need weeks to recover." The next morning arrived gray and cold. The Henderson boy was unconscious, burning with fever. His parents sat beside him, holding hands and praying. The other families packed their wagons quietly, avoiding eye contact with the doomed family. Captain Morris gave the order to move out. One by one, the wagons began rolling west. Sarah turned back to watch the Hendersons' wagon grow smaller in the distance. Mr. Henderson stood beside it, his arm around his wife's shoulders as she sobbed. "It's not right," Sarah whispered. For 3 days, the convoy made good time. The weather held, and they covered nearly 15 miles each day. But on the 4th morning, Sarah woke to find frost covering their wagon canvas. Winter was coming faster than anyone expected. "Storm clouds ahead," called out Marcus Webb, their scout. "Big ones." By afternoon, the first snowflakes began to fall. Within hours, the gentle flakes had become a blizzard. The wagon master called a halt near a cluster of rocks that provided some shelter. "We waited out," Morris announced. "Should blow over by tomorrow." But the storm didn't stop. For 2 full days, snow pounded their camp. When it finally cleared, they faced a landscape transformed. Snow drifts blocked the trail in every direction. The temperature had dropped so low that water froze solid in their containers. "We're trapped," Dr. Whitman told Morris quietly. "Can't move the wagons through this snow." Morris studied the white wasteland ahead of them. His face had gone pale. "How long until we can travel again?" "Could be days. Could be weeks. If another storm hits." Whitman didn't finish the sentence. That evening, Families huddled together for warmth. Food supplies that had seemed adequate now looked desperately short. If they were stuck here for weeks, people would start dying of hunger and cold. Sarah held her children close, as James added precious wood to their small fire. Around them, other families faced the same terrible reality. They had abandoned the Hendersons to save themselves, but now they were trapped anyway. "Mama, I'm cold," Emma whispered. Sarah pulled the little girl closer. "I know, sweetheart. Papa will keep the fire going." But Sarah knew their firewood wouldn't last much longer. None of them had prepared for a long stop in this desolate place. They had planned to be in Oregon Territory by now, safe and warm in new homes. On the third day after the storm, their worst fears began to come true. Old Mr. Peterson, who had been fighting a cough for weeks, died during the night. His wife found him frozen in their wagon at dawn. The ground was too hard to dig a grave. They wrapped his body in blankets and placed it outside their camp, where the cold would preserve it until spring. "We need to make hard choices," Captain Morris told the gathered families. "We have food for maybe 2 weeks if we ration carefully. After that, some of us could go ahead on foot," suggested Tom Brady, a young man traveling with his pregnant wife. "Try to reach a settlement and bring back help." Morris nodded grimly. "It's dangerous, but it might be our only chance. I need volunteers." Several men stepped forward, including James. Sarah's heart clenched as she realized her husband was willing to leave them behind to try saving everyone. "I'll go," James said firmly. "My family can stay with the Webbs." "James, no," Sarah pleaded. "The children need their father." But James had already made up his mind. "If I don't try, we'll all die here anyway. At least this way, you have a chance." That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the wind howl across the snow. James would leave at dawn with 4 other men. They would carry minimal supplies and try to reach Fort Bridger, still over 100 miles away. Even if they survived the journey, it would take weeks to bring back help. She thought about the Hendersons, left behind to face winter alone with their sick child. Had they found shelter? Were they still alive? The irony was bitter. The wagon train had abandoned them to avoid this exact situation. Yet here they all were anyway, trapped and dying. As dawn approached, James gathered his supplies. He kissed Sarah and the children goodbye, promising to return with help. "Take care of each other," he whispered to Emma and Thomas. "Be good for your mama." Sarah watched her husband disappear into the white wilderness with the other volunteers. Around her, the remaining families huddled in their wagons, waiting for rescue that might never come. The wind picked up again, carrying the promise of another storm. Sarah pulled her children closer and tried to keep hope alive in her heart. But deep down, she wondered if she would ever see James again, or if they would all join Mr. Peterson in the frozen ground before spring arrived. Mrs. Webb invited Sarah and her children to share their wagon for warmth. As they settled in together, Sarah heard Emma ask quietly, "When is Papa coming back?" "Soon," Sarah lied, praying it would somehow be true. Outside, the wind grew stronger, and the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall. The second storm lasted 4 days. Sarah huddled with her children in the Webb family wagon, listening to the wind tear at the canvas walls. Outside, snow piled higher and higher around their camp. When the storm finally ended, they emerged to find their world completely changed. The snow was waist-deep in most places, with drifts reaching over the wagon tops. The trail they had followed was completely invisible. Even worse, 3 more people had died during the storm. Mrs. Peterson, who couldn't survive losing her husband, and 2 children from the Brady family. "We're down to half rations now," announced Dr. Whitman as he counted their remaining food supplies. "Maybe 8 days left if we're careful." Sarah's stomach was already cramping with hunger. Emma and Thomas were getting thinner every day, their eyes growing large in their pale faces. She gave them most of her food, but it still wasn't enough. "Any word from the rescue party?" asked Mrs. Webb. Captain Morris shook his head grimly. "They've been gone 6 days. If they made good time, they might reach Fort Bridger tomorrow. But in this snow," he didn't need to finish. Everyone knew the men might be dead already. That afternoon, young Marcus Webb made a disturbing discovery. While gathering firewood from a broken wagon, he found strange tracks in the snow leading away from their camp. "Look at these," he told his father, pointing to the deep impressions. "They're too big for any man." Mr. Webb studied the tracks carefully. They were the size of dinner plates, with claw marks clearly visible. "Mountain lion," he said quietly. "Big one." The news sent fear through the camp. With people weak from hunger and cold, they would be easy prey for a hungry predator. The men organized watches through the night, but they had little ammunition left. On the 7th day after James left, Sarah woke to find Emma burning with fever. The little girl's face was flushed red, and she shivered uncontrollably despite the warm blankets. "Mama, my throat hurts," Emma whispered. Dr. Whitman examined the child with growing concern. "It's the same sickness that took the Henderson boy," he told Sarah privately. "Without proper medicine." Sarah's world tilted. She had already lost her husband to the wilderness. Now her daughter might die too, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. She held Emma close, trying to share her body heat with the fevered child. Thomas sat nearby, his young face serious as he watched his sister suffer. "Is Emma going to die like Mr. Peterson?" Thomas asked quietly. "No," Sarah said firmly, though fear clawed at her heart. "Emma is strong. She's going to get better." But as the day wore on, Emma grew worse. Her fever climbed higher, and she began talking to people who weren't there. Sarah recognized the signs. She had seen them in the Henderson boy. That evening, as Sarah spooned precious water into Emma's mouth, she heard commotion outside the wagon. Voices were shouting, but she couldn't make out the words over Emma's labored breathing. Mrs. Webb's head appeared through the wagon opening. "Sarah, you need to see this." Reluctantly, Sarah left Emma with Thomas and climbed outside. In the distance, moving slowly across the snow, she could see dark figures approaching their camp. At first, she thought it might be James and the rescue party returning. But as the figures drew closer, her heart sank. It was the Henderson family. Mr. Henderson supported his wife as they stumbled through the deep snow. Behind them, their oldest son carried something wrapped in blankets. Sarah realized with horror that it was the body of their youngest child. The Hendersons collapsed at the edge of the camp, exhausted and half-frozen. Mrs. Henderson's face was streaked with tears that had turned to ice on her cheeks. "Our boy died 3 days ago," Mr. Henderson said simply. "We've been walking since then, following your trail." Captain Morris stepped forward, his face hard. "You can't stay here. We don't have food for extra mouths." "Please," Mrs. Henderson begged. "We have nowhere else to go." "You made your choice when you stayed behind," Morris replied coldly. "We can't save you now." But Sarah had heard enough. She pushed past Morris and took Mrs. Henderson's frozen hands in hers. "You can share our food," she said. "We'll make room." "Sarah, no," Morris protested. "Your own children are starving." "So were theirs," Sarah shot back. "We abandoned them once. I won't do it again." Other families began to speak up. The Webbs offered to share their wagon space. Dr. Whitman said he would tend to Mrs. Henderson's frostbite. Even some who had supported leaving the Hendersons behind now felt guilty enough to help. Morris saw he was outnumbered. "Fine," he said bitterly. "But when the food runs out and people start dying, remember this moment." Sarah helped the Hendersons into her wagon, where Emma lay delirious with fever. Mrs. Henderson took one look at the sick child and immediately began caring for her, despite her own exhaustion. "I know this sickness," she said softly. "Lost my boy to it. But maybe we can save yours." Using knowledge gained from nursing her own dying child, Mrs. Henderson worked through the night to bring down Emma's fever. She made herbal tea from plants she had gathered during their long walk. She showed Sarah how to wrap the child to break the fever cycle. By morning, Emma's fever had broken. She was still weak, but the crisis had passed. "Thank you," Sarah whispered to Mrs. Henderson. "You saved her life." Mrs. Henderson smiled sadly. "I couldn't save my own boy. At least I could save yours." But their relief was short-lived. On the 9th day after the rescue party left, their food situation became desperate. They were down to their last scraps of hardtack and dried meat. Children cried constantly from hunger. Some families began hoarding what little they had left. "We need to send another party for help," suggested Mr. Webb. "Can't wait any longer." Morris nodded reluctantly. "I'll go myself this time. Take 2 others. Rest of you stay put and try to survive until we get back." But before Morris could organize the new rescue mission, Marcus Webb came running into camp with startling news. "There are people coming up the trail," he shouted. "Lots of them." Everyone rushed outside to see a line of figures moving toward them through the snow. At first, they looked like more stranded travelers. But as they drew closer, Sarah's heart leaped with recognition. It was James. Her husband led a column of mountain men and soldiers from Fort Bridger. They carried packs full of supplies and pulled sleds loaded with food and medicine. Behind them came pack animals and fresh horses. "Sarah!" James called out as he spotted his family. He ran toward their wagon, crushing his wife and children in a fierce embrace. "Papa!" Emma cried weakly. "You came back. I promised I would," James said, tears streaming down his bearded face. "I promised I wouldn't leave you behind." The rescue party had brought enough supplies to feed everyone for weeks. They had medicine for the sick and warm clothes for the children. Most importantly, they had a plan to get everyone safely to Fort Bridger before the next storm hit. As families celebrated and shared the first real meal they had eaten in days, Sarah sat with James and told him everything that had happened. She described Emma's illness, the deaths in camp, and the return of the Henderson family. "You did the right thing helping them," James said firmly. "We should never have left them in the first place." Dr. Whitman, examining the survivors, was amazed that so many had lived through the ordeal. "Another week, and we would have lost half the camp," he told Morris privately. "These people are lucky to be alive." But Morris was studying the weather signs with growing concern. "We need to move fast," he told James. "There's another big storm building. If we get caught in the open again." James nodded grimly. He had seen the same signs during his journey to Fort Bridger. They would have to abandon most of their heavy belongings and travel light to reach safety before the storm hit. That evening, as families packed only their most essential belongings, Sarah found Mrs. Henderson sitting beside the small grave they had dug for her son. "I can't leave him here alone," Mrs. Henderson whispered. Sarah sat down beside her friend. "He's not alone," she said gently. "He's at peace now, and you need to think about your living children." Mrs. Henderson nodded slowly. "I know. It's just so hard. We'll come back for him in the spring," Sarah promised. "We'll give him a proper burial then." As dawn broke, the convoy prepared to leave their deadly camp behind. The abandoned wagons stood like tombstones in the snow, marking the place where so many dreams had died. But as Sarah helped Emma into the rescue sled, she felt hope stirring in her heart again. Her family was together. They had food and warm clothes. Most importantly, they had learned something valuable about the true meaning of loyalty and courage. James took her hand as the convoy began moving toward Fort Bridger. "I won't leave you behind again," he whispered. "Whatever happens, we stay together." Sarah squeezed his hand tightly. Behind them, the snow was already beginning to fall again, erasing all traces of their suffering. But ahead lay warmth, safety, and the promise of a new beginning. The journey to Fort Bridger took 8 grueling days through deep snow and freezing temperatures. Sarah walked beside the rescue sleds, her feet numb in her worn boots, while James helped guide the pack animals through the treacherous terrain. Emma and Thomas huddled together under thick blankets, still weak from their ordeal, but alive. The mountain men who had come with James knew every inch of this country. They led the convoy through narrow passes and hidden valleys, always staying one step ahead of the pursuing storm. At night, they built large fires and shared stories of survival that both frightened and inspired the weary travelers. "Worst winter in 20 years, said Mountain Joe, the grizzled leader of the rescue party. Animals are coming down from the high country early, looking for food. Seen more wolf packs this season than I can count." Sarah shuddered at his words. She had heard wolves howling in the distance every night since they started this journey. The sound reminded her constantly that death was never far away in this wilderness. On the fourth day, they faced their greatest challenge yet. A narrow canyon blocked their path, its walls rising like giant teeth on both sides. The trail through was barely wide enough for a single horse, and ice covered the rocky surface. "Only way through," Mountain Joe explained to James and Captain Morris. "But if that storm catches us in the canyon, we're finished." Looking back, Sarah could see dark clouds building on the horizon. They were racing against time and losing. How long to get everyone through? James asked. Joe studied the line of people and pack animals. 4 hours, maybe 5 if we're careful. Morris checked the sky again. Storm will hit in 3. They had no choice but to try. The alternative was turning back into the wilderness, where they would certainly freeze to death. One by one, people and animals began making their way through the treacherous canyon. Sarah carried Thomas while James led their horse through the icy passage. Emma walked between them, her small hand gripping James's coat. Every step was dangerous. One slip could send them tumbling down the rocky slope into the rushing creek below. Halfway through the canyon, disaster struck. Mrs. Henderson, still weak from her long ordeal, lost her footing on a patch of ice. She cried out as she began sliding toward the edge of the trail. Without thinking, James lunged forward and grabbed her arm, stopping her fall just inches from disaster. But the sudden movement caused their horse to panic. The animal reared up, its hooves slipping on the ice. "Look out!" someone shouted. The horse toppled backward, its heavy pack crashing down onto the narrow trail. The impact loosened a pile of rocks above them, and suddenly, the canyon filled with the rumble of a small avalanche. "Run!" Mountain Joe yelled from ahead. "Everyone run!" Sarah grabbed her children and sprinted forward as rocks bounced all around them. Behind her, she could hear the terrified shouts of other families as they fled the falling stones. Dust and snow filled the air, making it hard to see or breathe. When the rock slide finally stopped, they discovered they had lost 2 pack animals and most of their extra supplies. Worse, the trail behind them was completely blocked. There was no going back now. "We're committed," Joe said grimly. "Have to make it to the fort with what we've got." They reached the end of the canyon just as the first snowflakes began to fall. The storm had caught up with them at last. For the next 2 days, they traveled through a white nightmare of wind and snow, following Joe and his men by faith alone. Emma collapsed on the 6th day. The little girl had been fighting her illness with remarkable courage, but the cold and exhaustion finally overwhelmed her small body. She fell unconscious in the snow, her breathing shallow and rapid. "We have to stop," Sarah pleaded as James lifted their daughter. "She needs rest." But Mountain Joe shook his head. "Stop now, and we all die. Fort's only 2 days ahead. She has to hold on." James cradled Emma against his chest as they continued through the blizzard. Sarah walked beside them, holding Thomas's hand and praying with every step that her daughter would survive. She had already lost so much, she couldn't bear to lose Emma too. Dr. Whitman did what he could for the child, but his medical supplies were nearly exhausted. "Keep her warm," he told Sarah. "Talk to her. Let her know you're here." So Sarah talked to Emma constantly as they walked, telling her stories of the beautiful farm they would have in Oregon, describing the warm house James would build for them, painting pictures of summer days filled with sunshine and flowers. "Can you hear me, sweetheart?" Sarah whispered. "Mama's here. Papa's here. We're going to be safe soon." Sometimes Emma would stir and whisper a few words, but mostly she lay still and silent in James's arms. With each passing hour, she seemed to fade a little more. On the 7th day, just when Sarah thought she couldn't take another step, Mountain Joe pointed ahead through the swirling snow. "There she is, folks. Fort Bridger." Through the white curtain of the storm, Sarah could see the dark outline of wooden walls and the welcoming glow of windows. Smoke rose from chimneys, promising warmth and safety at last. The fort's gates opened to receive them, and suddenly they were surrounded by soldiers and civilians offering help. Hands reached out to take children and support exhausted adults. Blankets appeared from nowhere to wrap around shivering families. Emma was rushed to the fort's infirmary, where the post surgeon took charge of her care. Sarah refused to leave her daughter's side as the doctor examined the unconscious child. "She's very sick," the surgeon told them honestly. "Pneumonia on top of everything else. But she's young and strong. With proper care and medicine, she has a fighting chance." For 3 days, Sarah sat beside Emma's bed in the warm infirmary, watching her daughter fight for life. James brought her meals and sat with her through the long nights. Thomas stayed with the Webb family, but visited every day to read stories to his sister. On the 4th morning, Emma's eyes fluttered open. "Mama," she whispered, "are we safe now?" Sarah burst into tears of relief. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe. Papa found us and brought us home." Emma's recovery was slow, but steady. As she grew stronger, other survivors of their ordeal began to share their stories. They learned that 3 more families had died during the final push to the fort, victims of cold and exhaustion who simply couldn't go any further. But most had survived, including the Henderson family. Mrs. Henderson spent her days helping in the infirmary, caring for sick children with the same gentleness she had shown Emma. Her husband worked with the fort's carpenter, learning skills that would serve him well when they finally reached Oregon. Captain Morris, humbled by their close brush with disaster, approached Sarah one evening as she sat with Emma in the infirmary. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "And I owe the Hendersons one too. You were right to help them. I let fear make me cruel." Sarah looked up at the gruff wagon master. "We all did what we thought was best. The important thing is we learned from it." Morris nodded slowly. "When spring comes and we continue to Oregon, there'll be no more abandoning people. We stick together no matter what." As the weeks passed and winter settled over the fort, the survivors began to heal both physically and emotionally. Children played together in the snow-covered courtyard. Adults shared skills and stories around the communal fires. Slowly, they transformed from a collection of desperate refugees into a real community. James found work with the fort's blacksmith, earning money to buy supplies for the continuation of their journey. Sarah helped the fort's women with cooking and sewing, learning valuable skills from experienced frontier wives. Even Emma, once she was well enough to leave the infirmary, began attending lessons with the other children. One evening, as Sarah tucked Emma and Thomas into their beds in the family quarters they shared with the Webbs, Emma asked the question that had been weighing on her mind. "Mama, why do people want to leave the Hendersons behind?" Sarah thought carefully about how to answer. Sometimes when people are scared, they make bad choices. They think only about their own families and forget about helping others. "But you helped them," Thomas pointed out, even when Captain Morris said not to. "Because it was the right thing to do," Sarah explained. "Your papa taught me that we never leave people behind when they need help. That's what makes us human." Emma nodded solemnly. "When we get to Oregon, I want to help people too." "I know you will, sweetheart," Sarah said, kissing her daughter's forehead. "You have a good heart." Outside their window, snow continued to fall on the peaceful fort. Inside, surrounded by the warmth of family and community, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude. They had survived the worst trial of their lives and emerged stronger for it. James appeared in the doorway, his face glowing from the cold air outside. "Spring's still months away," he told Sarah. "But when it comes, we'll be ready, all of us together." Sarah took his hand as they watched their children settle into sleep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight they were safe, warm, and united as a family. The wilderness had tested them terribly, but it had also taught them invaluable lessons about loyalty, courage, and the true meaning of community. When they finally reached Oregon territory, they would carry those lessons with them as they built their new lives. "I love you," James whispered as they prepared for bed. "I love you too," Sarah replied. "And I'm proud of what we did out there. Even when it was hard, we did the right thing." James squeezed her hand gently. "We kept our promises to each other and to the people who needed help. That's what matters most." As sleep finally claimed them, Sarah dreamed of warm summer days in Oregon Territory, where children played safely in meadows and families gathered around dinner tables filled with plenty. It was a dream worth all the hardship they had endured to reach it. Spring arrived at Fort Bridger with the sound of melting snow and the songs of returning birds. Sarah stood in the courtyard watching Emma and Thomas play with other children, their laughter echoing off the wooden walls. After months of confinement during the harsh winter, everyone was eager to venture outside again. James worked nearby, helping to repair wagons that had been damaged during their harrowing journey. The blacksmith had taught him new skills during the long winter months, and now he could fix wheels, forge iron parts, and even shoe horses. These abilities would be valuable when they finally resumed their trek to Oregon Territory. "Spring means traveling season," announced Captain Morris as he addressed the gathered families one morning in early April. "We can start planning our departure for Oregon. Should be ready to leave within the month." Excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. After spending the winter in the cramped quarters of the fort, everyone was ready to complete their journey to the promised land. But Sarah noticed that some families seemed hesitant, whispering among themselves with worried expressions. That evening, the Hendersons approached James and Sarah as they sat outside their quarters enjoying the warm air. "We need to talk with you about something important," Mr. Henderson said, his voice heavy with concern. Mrs. Henderson looked particularly troubled. "We've been thinking all winter about continuing to Oregon, but we're not sure it's the right choice for us anymore." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, though she suspected what was coming. Mr. Henderson sat down beside them. "We lost everything during that storm. Our youngest boy, most of our supplies, our wagon. We barely survived the winter, even with everyone's help. The fort's carpenter offered me a permanent job," he continued. "Good wages, steady work. We could build a life here instead of risking everything again on the trail." Sarah felt her heart sink. The Hendersons had become like family during their shared ordeal. The thought of losing them felt like another abandonment. "But Oregon is where we all plan to start over," James pointed out gently. "You've come so far already." Mrs. Henderson wiped tears from her eyes. "We're scared, James. What if something happens again? What if we can't protect our surviving children?" Emma, who had been playing nearby, came running over with Thomas close behind. "Are Mr. and Mrs. Henderson coming to Oregon with us?" she asked innocently. The adults exchanged uncomfortable glances. "We're still discussing it, sweetheart," Sarah told her daughter. But Emma's question had cut to the heart of the matter. Over the winter, their group had become a true family. The idea of breaking apart now seemed wrong to everyone involved. Over the next few days, other families began expressing similar doubts. The Webb family worried about Mr. Webb's lingering cough from the winter. The Brady family was concerned about traveling with their newborn baby. Even Dr. Whitman questioned whether he should continue, given how much the fort needed medical care. Sarah watched their close-knit community begin to fracture and felt desperate to hold it together. These people had suffered together, survived together, and learned to depend on each other. Losing that bond would be like losing part of themselves. One evening, as she helped Mrs. Henderson with mending clothes, Sarah brought up her concerns. "I understand why you're frightened," she said carefully. "We all are. But remember what we learned last winter about sticking together." Mrs. Henderson paused in her sewing. "That's exactly why we should stay here, where it's safe. We can't protect each other if we're all dead on the trail." "But we can protect each other," Sarah insisted. "We proved that. When things got desperate, we chose to help instead of abandon. That made us stronger, not weaker." Mrs. Henderson looked up with sad eyes. "And look what it cost us. My little boy died anyway. All that suffering, and for what?" Sarah didn't have a good answer for that. The winter had tested them all beyond their limits. Some had paid a price too high to measure. The next morning brought disturbing news. Mountain Joe arrived at the fort with reports from other wagon trains attempting the Oregon Trail. Bad year for traveling, he told Captain Morris. Cholera outbreak hit a train near Fort Laramie. Another group got caught in a late blizzard in the Blue Mountains. Lost half their people. Morris gathered the families to share this information. I won't lie to you folks, he said grimly. The trail's dangerous this year. Might be wise to wait another season. But Sarah could see the fear in people's eyes growing stronger. Another winter at the fort would only make it harder to leave. Some families would never find the courage to continue their journey. That night, she lay awake thinking about everything they had been through. The original dream of reaching Oregon Territory seemed to be slipping away, replaced by the safer but smaller hope of surviving where they were. James sensed a restlessness. What's troubling you? He asked quietly. We're giving up, Sarah said. All of us. After everything we survived, we're letting fear win. James was quiet for a long moment. Maybe staying here isn't giving up. Maybe it's learning wisdom. Or maybe it's forgetting why we left home in the first place, Sarah replied. Remember what you told me when we started this journey? Oregon Territory was our chance for a better life, land of our own, a future for our children. That was before we almost lost everything, James pointed out. Before we learned how dangerous this country really is. Sarah turned to face her husband in the darkness. The danger is why we need each other. Families traveling alone get destroyed out here. But together, we survived the worst winter in 20 years. Over the next week, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of trying to convince others to continue the journey, she began organizing the families to help each other regardless of what they chose. Some of you want to stay here, and that's understandable, she told the gathered group. Others still want to reach Oregon. But we don't have to abandon each other either way. She proposed that those staying at the fort help outfit and supply those continuing west. In return, the Oregon-bound families would establish connections for trade and communication once they reach their destination. We can be one community across two places, Sarah explained. Distance doesn't have to mean abandonment. The idea sparked new hope in both groups. Families who had been afraid to stay or afraid to go began to see possibilities they hadn't considered. Mrs. Henderson was the first to speak up. If we stayed here and build up the trading post, we could help supply future wagon trains. Make the journey safer for other families. Mr. Webb nodded enthusiastically. And if some of us establish farms in Oregon, we could send back information about the best routes and settlements. Dr. Whitman saw the medical possibilities immediately. I could train some of you in basic medical care before you leave. Help you handle emergencies on the trail. Suddenly, instead of a painful separation, they were planning an expansion of their community. The fear that had been pulling them apart began transforming into excitement about new possibilities. Captain Morris, watching this development with amazement, pulled Sarah aside. This is remarkable thinking, he told her. You've turned a problem into an opportunity. But Sarah shook her head. I learned it from you, actually. Remember what you said about hard choices? Sometimes the hardest choice is refusing to choose between impossible options. As spring progressed, the two groups worked together to prepare for both staying and going. James used his new blacksmith skills to forge tools and hardware that the Oregon-bound families would need. Mrs. Henderson organized the women to preserve food and medicine for the journey. Emma and Thomas, oblivious to the adult concerns, simply enjoyed having their friends around to play with every day. To them, the idea that their community could exist in two places seemed perfectly natural. Will we still be able to visit the Hendersons in Oregon? Emma asked one day. Not for a while, Sarah explained. But we'll write letters and send messages through the travelers who pass by. Thomas considered this carefully. Like having family in two houses. Sarah smiled at her son's simple wisdom. Exactly like that. By late April, the final decisions were made. 12 families would continue to Oregon Territory with Captain Morris, while 8 families would remain at Fort Bridger to build the new trading post community. The night before departure, both groups gathered for a farewell celebration. Mountain Joe played his fiddle while families shared food, stories, and promises to stay connected despite the distance. Mrs. Henderson approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "I wish we had your courage," she said. "I wish we could come with you." "You have plenty of courage," Sarah assured her. "It takes courage to stay and build something new here, too. We're both following our hearts." As the evening wound down, children began falling asleep in their parents' arms. The adults talked quietly about practical matters, how to send messages, when to expect supply wagons, who would coordinate between the two communities. James found Sarah sitting by the fire, watching the flames dance against the dark sky. "Having second thoughts?" he asked, settling beside her. "No," Sarah said firmly. "This feels right. We're not abandoning anyone this time. We're growing instead of shrinking." Emma appeared at Sarah's elbow, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Mama, are we really leaving tomorrow?" "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to finish our journey to Oregon." "Will it be scary like before?" Sarah pulled her daughter onto her lap. "It might be hard sometimes, but we've learned how to take care of each other. And we'll always remember the friends we're leaving behind here." Emma nodded solemnly. "They'll remember us too." As the fire died down to glowing embers, families began returning to their quarters for their last night together. Tomorrow would bring another separation, but this time it felt like hope instead of fear. Sarah looked around at the faces of the people who had become her extended family through shared hardship. Some would travel with her to Oregon Territory. Others would remain to build a new life at Fort Bridger. But all would carry forward the lessons they had learned about loyalty, courage, and the true meaning of community. The morning of departure dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers across the prairie. Sarah stood beside their newly repaired wagon, watching James secure their carefully packed supplies. After months of preparation, they were finally ready to complete their journey to Oregon Territory. Emma and Thomas ran around the courtyard with their friends, making the most of their last morning together. The children seemed to understand that this goodbye would be different from others, longer and more permanent, but they faced it with the resilience that children possess. "Time to load up," Captain Morris called out. His voice carried the authority it always had, but Sarah could hear a new note of respect in how he spoke to the families. Their shared ordeal had changed him, just as it had changed all of them. 12 wagons formed up in a line, much smaller than the original convoy that had left Independence, Missouri, almost a year ago. But these families had been tested by fire and proven their commitment to each other. They were no longer a collection of strangers bound by common destination, but a true community united by shared experience. The Henderson family stood with the other Fort residents, waving goodbye as the wagons began to roll. Mrs. Henderson held a package wrapped in brown paper, letters for each traveling family to be opened when they reached Oregon Territory. "Don't forget to write," she called to Sarah. "Tell us everything about your new home." "We will," Sarah promised, blinking back tears. "Take care of yourselves. We'll send word as soon as we arrive." As Fort Bridger disappeared behind them, Sarah felt a mixture of sadness and anticipation. They were leaving behind people who had become family, but they were also moving toward the dream that had started their journey. The trail conditions were much better than the previous autumn. Spring rains had filled water sources and encouraged fresh grass for their animals. Game was plentiful, and the weather stayed mostly fair. After their terrible winter experience, everything seemed easier by comparison. James rode beside the wagon, keeping a careful eye on their oxen while Sarah drove. Emma and Thomas walked alongside when the terrain permitted, gathering flowers and interesting stones to add to their collection of trail memories. "Look, Mama," Emma called out, pointing to a hillside covered with bright yellow blooms. "It's like someone spilled sunshine everywhere." Sarah smiled at her daughter's description. Emma had grown so much during their ordeal, not just physically but in wisdom and maturity. The little girl who had almost died in the winter storm was now a thoughtful child with deep appreciation for life's simple beauties. On their third day out from Fort Bridger, they encountered their first real test. A river, swollen by spring runoff, blocked their path. The ferry that normally operated there had been destroyed in the winter floods. "Water's too deep to ford," Captain Morris announced after scouting the crossing. "We'll have to build our own ferry." Instead of despair, the news brought out the best in the group. Men who had learned carpentry skills during the winter worked together to construct a simple raft. Women organized the children and prepared hot meals for the workers. Everyone contributed whatever they could. James, using his new blacksmith skills, fashioned metal brackets to hold the ferry together. "Good thing I learned this trade," he told Sarah as he worked. "Never know when it might come in handy." Dr. Whitman treated several minor injuries as families worked to move their heavy wagons across the improvised ferry. "We make a good team," he commented to Sarah as he bandaged a cut on young Marcus Webb's hand. "Much better than we did when we started this journey." The river crossing took 2 full days, but nobody complained about the delay. They had learned patience during their winter at the fort, and they understood that rushing led to mistakes and accidents. On the evening of their successful crossing, families gathered around a large campfire to share their meal. The conversation naturally turned to memories of their journey, both the hardships they had endured and the lessons they had learned. "Remember when we first started out?" asked Mrs. Brady, bouncing her baby on her knee. "We were all so worried about Indians and wild animals. Turns out the weather was our biggest enemy." "Weather and our own fear," added Mr. Webb. "Fear made us cruel to people who needed help." Thomas, sitting between his parents, looked up at the adults with curious eyes. "But you learned how to be brave again, right?" The simple question from the 6-year-old brought smiles to every face around the fire. Out of the mouths of babes came the truth they had all discovered. "Yes, son," James said, ruffling Thomas's hair. "We learned that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you're scared." As they continued westward, the landscape began to change. Rolling hills gave way to rugged mountains. Rivers ran clearer and faster. The air grew thinner and cleaner. They were entering the final phase of their journey. One morning, as they crested a particularly high ridge, Captain Morris called a halt. He pointed ahead to where the trail descended into a vast valley dotted with settlements and farms. "There it is, folks," he said with satisfaction. "Oregon Territory. We made it." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she looked at the promised land spread out before them. Fields of green crops stretched as far as she could see. Smoke rose from farmhouse chimneys. Children played in schoolyards. It was everything they had dreamed of during those long, dark days of winter. Emma and Thomas pressed close to their parents, awed by the sight of their new home. "Is that really Oregon?" Emma whispered. "That's it, sweetheart," Sarah said, holding her daughter tight. "That's where we're going to live now." The final descent into the valley took most of the day. Word of their arrival spread quickly among the existing settlements, and soon people were coming out to greet them. These were families who had made the same journey in previous years, and they understood exactly what the newcomers had endured. "Welcome to Oregon Territory," called a bearded man as he approached their wagon. "Name's Samuel Morrison. Been here 3 years now. What you folks need most right now, food, rest, or information?" "All 3. James replied with a grin. "Been a long journey." Morrison laughed. "They all are, friend. But you made it, and that's what counts. Come on, let's get you settled." That evening, the Morrison family hosted a welcome dinner for the new arrivals. Other neighbors contributed food, tools, and advice for getting established in their new home. Sarah was amazed by the generosity and kindness of people who had been strangers just hours before. "Frontier folks look after each other," explained Mrs. Morrison as she served Sarah another helping of fresh bread. "We all know what it's like to be new and need help." As the days passed, the families from their wagon train began establishing their own homesteads throughout the valley. James found good land near a stream, perfect for farming and close enough to town for the children to attend school. Building their house became a community project, with neighbors volunteering labor and expertise. In return, James used his blacksmith skills to help others with their own construction and repair needs. Emma and Thomas adapted quickly to their new life. They made friends with local children and threw themselves into learning about their new environment. Emma discovered a talent for gardening, while Thomas showed remarkable ability with animals. 3 months after their arrival, Sarah was working in her kitchen when she heard the sound of approaching wagons. Looking out the window, she saw a familiar sight, a dusty convoy of travelers making their way into the valley. "James," she called to her husband, who was working in the barn. "There's a new wagon train coming in." They walked out to the road to watch the newcomers arrive. Sarah felt a deep sympathy for the exhausted families, remembering her own first day in Oregon Territory. But as the lead wagon drew closer, Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Driving the team was a familiar figure, Mrs. Henderson. "Sarah," Mrs. Henderson called out, waving frantically. "Sarah, is that really you?" Within moments, the two women were embracing in the middle of the road, both crying with joy and surprise. "What are you doing here?" Sarah asked when she could finally speak. "I thought you were staying at Fort Bridger." "We changed our minds," Mr. Henderson explained as he climbed down from the wagon. "After you left, we realized we were making our decision based on fear instead of hope. Didn't seem right. So you came after us?" "The whole Fort community decided together," Mrs. Henderson said, gesturing to the wagons behind her. "Those who wanted to farm came to Oregon. Those who wanted to trade stayed behind. But we're all still connected, just like you suggested." Emma and Thomas came running from the house, shouting with delight at seeing their friends again. Soon all the children were laughing and playing together as if they had never been separated. That evening, Sarah and James hosted a reunion dinner for the newly arrived families. As they sat around the long table, sharing food and stories, Sarah reflected on the amazing journey that had brought them all together. "Remember what you told me last winter?" James said quietly as they watched their children play with their friends. "You said we should never leave people behind. Turns out you were right about more than just survival." Sarah squeezed his hand under the table. "We all learned something important on that trail. We learned that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who choose to stand by you when things get hard." Later, as she tucked Emma and Thomas into their beds in their new home, Emma asked the question that had been on her mind all evening. "Mama, are we done traveling now? Are we going to stay here forever?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I think we're home, sweetheart. But that doesn't mean our adventures are over. There will always be new challenges, new friends to help, new things to learn. Will we always help people who need it?" "Always," Sarah promised. "That's what Papa taught us. We never leave people behind." Thomas, already half asleep, mumbled, "Like a family." "Exactly like a family," Sarah agreed. Outside their window, the Oregon Territory stretched away under a blanket of stars. Somewhere in the distance, new wagon trains were still making their way west, following the same trail Sarah's family had traveled. Some would face the same challenges and dangers they had encountered. But Sarah knew that when those travelers arrived, they would find a community ready to welcome them, help them, and teach them the same lessons about loyalty and courage that had been learned through hardship and shared suffering. As she prepared for bed, Sarah felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them here. It had cost them much, friends lost, hardships endured, fears conquered. But it had also given them something invaluable, the knowledge that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they chose to stand together. James appeared in the bedroom doorway, silhouetted against the lamplight from the kitchen. "Ready for bed? Ready for whatever comes next," Sarah replied, taking his hand as he had taken hers so many times during their long journey to this moment. Together, they had kept their promise. They had never left each other behind, and they had learned to extend that same loyalty to others who needed it. Now, in the home they had built with their own hands and the land they had reached through their own courage, they could rest knowing that they had found not just a destination, but a purpose. The frontier had tested them and taught them. Now it was their turn to help others who would follow in their footsteps, carrying forward the lessons of community, courage, and never abandoning those in need.